This session is called Listening to Music, a private or a public activity. My name is Angus Kennedy. This session has been put together with the help of the Institute of Ideas Arts and Society Forum, and in a way we're going to look at the phenomenology, that's a nasty word, the experience of listening to music. And it's quite a strange thing, arguably, in itself, just listening to music. But it's also a strange thing in the way in which we do it has changed over time. So arguably, we used to listen to more or less the same sort of thing. Maybe a more limited range of music was available in the 19th century than there is in the 21st century. And we used to listen to music publicly, but privately at the same time. And we heard the same things, but it meant different things to us as individuals. And arguably, again, people used to play music privately in their own homes for entertainment before the television than they do today. Today, of course, there's lots more music around from around the world, and it's around more in lots of different ways. On your iPad or iPod, you will have more music available to you to carry around than anybody would have dreamt in any way, and audiences are very much more diverse. And that's one of the things we might look at as well, is that, are we all listening to more music, but fewer of us are listening to the same music, and so maybe we're sharing that experience less, and does that matter? Does it end up with us being in something of a passive relationship to music, consuming more of it, but getting less out of it because we put less into it? Those are just some of the questions that are evolved around the question of listening to music, which is a huge one. So my panelists have got a thankless task in 5 to 7 minutes each to give you not the answers to that question, because that would just be silly, but to get us all thinking, and then we can explore it and carry it on afterwards. So in the order that they're going to give those introductions, first on my left, Marshall Marcus, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the European Youth Orchestra and the chair, importantly, of Systema Europe. His very long career in music, used to oversee the South Bank music program, and is involved in any number of musical initiatives, playing, publishing, writing about, involved in music in lots of ways that I can't summarize, but very glad to have Marshall on the panel. Second up, on my immediate right, Gabriella Swallow, who's a cellist, but also a broadcaster, an arts commentator, very passionate about contemporary music, has recorded all of the British contemporary composers. Well, he's not contemporary anymore, but he was sort of, what would you say? Contemporary, is that fine for Hugh Wood?
Yes.
Yes? Okay.
Yeah. He wants to be classed as a contemporary composer.
It's just a fast-moving world, contemporary, but absolutely. And I think Gabriella might be going to treat us to, some of you might see the end of her cello, which is a very lovely and old instrument, 1820?
Yes.
I think, yes. So we might get a demonstration, so that's an added bonus. And then, last but not least, on my far right, Ivan Hewitt, who's the chief music critic at the Daily Telegraph and a professor at the Royal College of Music, also a broadcaster, and the author of a great book, which I do recommend, Music, Healing the Rift. And some of you may have seen a sort of preview of some of his thoughts published in the Telegraph yesterday. If you missed that, go and look at it online, called The Battle of Ideas. Are we still able to listen to music properly? But we'll come to that. In the meantime, drum rolls. Marshall, would you start us off?
Sure. I think it's very interesting the way you referred just then to we all used to listen to music in the same sort of way. And if you read, for example, the kind of literature about this session, it's very, very interesting looking at the historical size that it has, that it talks a bit about things that have happened in the last few years, and then it goes back to, let's say, the 18th century or something like that. And I think it's worth thinking about for this whole subject, going much further back, actually, about what humanities approach to listening has been to over the kind of long history. And when I began to look at this question, it struck me that there were two ways to prize it open. So one of the things that interests me about it is what someone like Luigi Nono used to call the act of listening. What actually goes into the way that we listen and how private and public might affect that. But the other thing, I think, is a much bigger question, which is about how we come together. So public listening is a vehicle for coming together in a society as a species to come and do something. And as I thought more, increasingly that seemed to me the kind of interesting area of it. Now, there's no doubt that in the last few years, in the last 5, 10, 15 years, there have been huge changes in the way that we can listen privately or publicly, actually to the extent that I'd suggest that public or private in itself, they're just extremes, and actually what we've almost invented in the last half century is what lives in between those as different forms of public, private, private, public. If you go back long enough, of course, though, it's a different thing. And I think in a way that the big change happened, let's say, 30, 40 years ago, and I'm going to blame a couple of people for this, actually. Nobutoshi Kihara and Akio Morita, I'm going to talk about in a while, a couple of Japanese gentlemen in the late 70s. But if we just think of going backwards, actually, in terms of public listening really was all that was available many thousands and thousands of years ago. And of course, there are huge numbers of ways that people have come together to do that in the interim, you know, around the fire, playing, processional music, Greek Roman amphitheatres used for that kind of thing, bars, theatres, concert halls, music halls, arenas now, stadiums. The places we listen to publicly have changed a lot, but actually for 99.9% of our history as human beings, we've basically gathered in places to do that. So I was thinking it's very interesting that it almost feels to me like the last time when public listening really had, I would say, a kind of freedom about it. I don't mean freedom in terms of not having to pay for the ticket, but freedom in the way that you approach coming together to listen. I was thinking of kind of late 18th century. Take Paris in the 1770s and 1780s. There's a kind of rage for coming to concerts in that period. There are extraordinary descriptions of people crying in concerts, of people fainting. And it obviously functioned then as something where, sure, it was a party, it was sometimes a way of dining, going to the concert, it was a way of seeing celebrity, but it also remained an incredible vessel for a kind of powerful expression. And then, as we go into the 19th century, it's quite interesting what happens. I remember discovering that in around 1810 or 15, I've not actually found the book, apparently the first handbook for how to behave in a concert hall is found. And this is the beginning of a huge change. You know, the middle class, the emancipated, we can talk about that word later, middle class is going into the new concert halls and listening to music. And I suspect kind of wondering how they're supposed to behave. It's quite interesting, actually. I looked on a website, it turned out to be the Perth Concert Hall. You know, they actually have 3 house rules here. Latecomers will not be admitted until a suitable break during the performance. 2, mobile telephones and electronic devices are to be turned off during the performance. 3, cameras, video cameras and tape recorders will not be permitted without the consent of the promoter. I actually sat down after that and I thought, well, what actually are the rules that we do? And I wrote down about 20 different rules. I'm not going to bore you with them now, but I'll just, Rule 7. Listeners must not use lights or any other physical, auditory, visual or tactile behaviour that may distract the audience or performers. However, it is admissible to stand at the end of a performance that is deemed to be particularly impressive. This is known as a standing ovation. One should not otherwise stand. Yeah, I mean, you can kind of have fun doing this, and there are all sorts of different rules. That's in the classical way. Now, I think that, therefore, is the first big change that started for us to kind of, as humans, to think, well, maybe this isn't the way to listen to music. It became very, very formalized, very rigid. And that, of course, is mainly something you talk about with classical music. But in the second half of the 19th century, there's another massive change, which is something we'll obviously focus on, and that is recording. I think the phonautograph, which was invented in 1857, is the first recording device. And then 21 years later, Edison has the phonograph. We're obviously massively used to the idea of recording, not just recording to listen later, but also broadcast live, deferred, relayed, whatever. So that, it seems to me, is obviously one of the, it's obvious that that's one of the big things that changed, the ability to be able to go and listen to something privately. That's when it all begins to start. And I find it quite interesting that I can think of my own experiences. I've had amazing possibilities being able to listen privately. Maybe I want to listen to, I don't know, a complex piece of music with a score like that. I can't do that in the concert hall in a kind of freedom. I'm going to worry about who's next to me and the way they're behaving. I've got no volume control in the concert hall. I mean, we could go through lots of these things where we live in a society where we like the idea of being able to control what we're doing, but actually we lack it in a public listening place. So this is what brings me now to the change, which I talked about before with these two Japanese gentlemen. Akio was the co-chairman of Sony in the 1970s, and he had a lot of long flights to do. And he went to Nobutoshi, who was one of his best audio engineers at Sony, and he said, look, I love opera. I'm traveling on planes all the time on long flights. What can I do to be able to listen to it? And the thing that resulted from that was the Sony Walkman, which was debuted in 1978 and then sold in 79. I can even remember when those things came out and how it began to change things. And I think that is the beginning of an incredibly powerful moment for private listening and public listening, because what we're moving to from there is from the idea of mass private listening, which was possible, to mass mobile private listening. And that's something which it seems to me has absolutely revolutionized the way that we listen to music, because suddenly you can take that wonderful private world with you out into society. And of course, that's a fantastic piece of autonomy for us. It's great freedom. Huge creativity has been used to make all sorts of ways that we can use that, from live streaming to netcasting to podcasting to sodcasting to you name it. So the huge possibilities there. That sounds great, but I wonder, and I have the feeling whether actually that kind of change is a change which we had to pay something extraordinary for. And I almost think of it as Pandora's mobile Walkman. It's as if we introduced a kind of virus into the way that we react as people together in society. And I see that increasingly as a very powerful effector of the way as a society that we do. So just to kind of wrap up on this, what I would say is that that's why I felt the second of the things I talked about at the beginning, which was not about listening to music. Actually, I think this topic is not really about listening. It's not about music for me. It's about how we relate as human beings. And it seems to me that we've brought about a kind of almost unconscious crisis. We're almost unaware of it most of the time. We have this fantastic independence, but we've paid mightily for it.
Brilliant. I mean, it's a great kick-off, a historical overview, and a possibility of a crisis as a result. Gabby, your thoughts?
Well, I'm going to speak to you really today from a very personal experience as a performer and interpreter of music. I play the cello in many different capacities, which include different venues, orchestras, bands, and genres. I find over the last 10 years especially, there's been a big change in how people listen to music. But firstly, I'd like to discuss how as musicians we come to accept that when we're employed, we accept our audiences are either going to listen to us or hear us, which are two very different things. For example, some of the music I play serves as a function. If my diary service calls me up, who manage my bookings, and asks me to go to Angel Studios, I put my headphones on and I play long notes to click tracks for Downton Abbey, I can guarantee that no one's focusing on what Cello 3 is doing during the death of Lady Sybil. But this is our bread and butter. What we really need to think about is when we do want to be heard, or rather listened to. Live performance is changing in all our fields. Firstly, in pop music, it's due to a financial thing. In the 60s and 70s, it was quite normal to sell literally millions of records in order to have a coveted #1 single or album. Since we've begun the 21st century, it's now possible to sell as little as 23,000 physical copies and have the same achievement. Downloads have now got their own charts, music production is happening at home, and digitally sharing music are all factors in this. The recording industry is not what artists such as Paul McCartney and Elton John are relying on to make money anymore. It's live performance, touring and merchandise and endorsement. As we know, as we've discussed, music has never been so accessible as it has been now. People have thousands of songs on their computers and iPods and have a very physically small collection of CDs, if at all. Albums that musicians have worked on for years can be deleted at the click of a mouse, not listened to in their entirety or listened to at all. When you make a record, this is part of the birthing experience, if you like. You don't have control over its consumption. You release it into the world and it becomes public property. As a composer or as an artist, you obviously wish and hope for an optimum listening experience for your music. At home with fantastic speakers, every detail of your creation to be taken in and focused on without distractions, especially the familiar digital twitch that we're all guilty of. But reality, listening to music is changing. Interesting, I learned this morning from an artist I'm working with that actually you can buy vinyl records now in Whole Foods in America. And I never thought about this before, that actually there is a renaissance. People are choosing to buy these things, and listen to them at home. But it is changing. People are hearing music all the time, sometimes without being aware of it. But this is why the experience of live music, in my opinion, has never had so much hope and potential. If we are saturated with it in our day-to-day lives, we need to make a point of actually listening, experiencing and sharing the music with other people in a room. This is something live music can still do with a unique effect. To bring music to an audience that you can see and can see you is a mutually rewarding experience. Audiences want the whole package when it comes to a performance. That's the point. It's a perfectly natural thing to desire, as when you physically see any person, in any circumstance, you make certain opinions on them, which give you an idea of who they are. This is no different on choosing to see a live performer, but then it comes with the added level of what they're playing and how they play it. Classical music is now finally taking note and not being defined by how it used to be listened to historically. We are understanding that an audience wants to get to know musicians, hear them talk about their music, as well as play very well. This can only help demystify us, and it doesn't have to take place at the Wigmore Hall anymore. When I first started at the Royal College, I was instructed not to play in any orchestras or chamber music groups because I had to focus on my technique. So my only outlet for any real music making was to join a band and moonlight at Ronnie Scott's. This was my dirty secret, as that it was not a common thing for a classical cellist to do. We moved forward 13 years, and I'm involved in a classical music club night there every 3 months, where their musicians are world-class, and the audience are as attentive as they are in any conventional classical music venue. Another example, in August this year, I was invited to watch Wayne Shorter's 80th birthday concert at the Hollywood Bowl in LA, where the capacity is 18,000 people. It wasn't full. There was probably about 15,000 people there. As I climbed to the top for my $5 seat, the most overwhelming experience, apart from Wayne's playing, was the silence around me. 15,000 people were together, sharing something totally unique in the moment, and it was a totally priceless experience for me. The spell made even opening our picnic an impossible task, as it would have broken the silence. We as performers feed off our audience, and things can be created which in any other moment may never happen. And I actually wanted to close by creating something for you here right now to demonstrate this. How you interpret it or listen to it is entirely up to you. If you love it, hate it, if you want to tweet through it, want to dissect it, it's up to you. In my opinion, the audience are crucially important in the creation of this, as I am. What I want to demonstrate is how, because of this precise moment, it will determine what will be heard and experienced in the only way live music has the power to do and will always do. And as I'm an improvising musician as well as an interpreter, I was rehearsing this morning with Pedro Segundo, who's the house drummer at Ronnie Scott's, and I asked him to come along. I didn't know he was going to be free. We haven't discussed what we're going to play now. He has to leave immediately afterwards to go to Ronnie Scott's, which is why he's going to walk out whilst we're finished. But we're going to just improvise something for you here right now.
I know, exactly. I've got to follow that. How do I do that? Well, I'd like to really trace a similar narrative to Marshall's opening address, but from a slightly different angle, which is from the angle of the music itself, I guess, the actual musical material. Because, the act of listening and the act of making they're like mirrors. The one helps to determine the other. And I think changes in ways of listening bring about changes in the musical material itself. And I think there has been, over time, a pronounced move away from what you might call a public kind of musical material to a private one, with results which have been, until quite recently, magnificent in a way. They've yielded a wonderful musical tradition, which we call classical music, which is mostly about creating subjective states in music. That's a kind of handy thumbnail definition of what classical music is about, I guess. But it's taken what seems to me a slightly pathological turn in recent, let's say, decades, driven by technology. So just to lead up to the now, I'd like to go back a long way. First by asking the question, what comes first? Privacy, which is one half of the equation in this debate, or music? And of course the answer is music. Music is really ancient. Privacy is rather new. Privacy, music goes back millennia, at least 25,000 years. That's the date of the earliest bone flutes, apparently. Privacy is a newfangled thing. It's really a luxury of Western rich societies. There are many parts of the world now where privacy still barely exists. I think in a Mumbai slum, you'd be hard put to find any privacy. Now, the repercussions in music have been at first very slow, but then at an increasing pace, and the acceleration has itself increased in pace, so it's become quite dizzying. At first, of course, as Marshall was saying, music was entirely public in both its forms and its manner of making. And to put it simply, everybody was part of it. There were no bystanders, there were no listeners. Everybody was part of the ritual or the dance or whatever the social activity was that the music was required to adorn. Everybody was part of it. And then increasingly you find, little by little, a division into those who make the music and those who help to, as it were, complete the social occasion, but aren't actually making any sounds. One example I like to think of is that day in 1695 when Queen Mary was buried and Purcell's great music for the funeral of Queen Mary was played. It was a horrible day. The rain was pelting down. There was mud everywhere. Apparently everyone was sliding around in the mud and the trumpeters had difficulty playing. And I often think of that situation thinking, was anybody listening? Well, of course they weren't. But in a sense, they were all part of making that occasion a solemn, appropriately solemn one. Come forward a little, and there's, I think, a wonderful moment which I'll dwell on just for a minute or so, where you have, I think, beautifully illustrated how public forms of musical utterance, which are basically collective, move into the private sphere, and in that private sphere help to articulate a form of subjectivity which is still, at this stage, largely shared. The thing I'm thinking of is Bach's great collection of keyboard music, the Klavierübung, published sometime in the 1730s or 40s, which he said was composed to the glory of God and the instruction of my neighbor. It's a rather nice description. And I think, well, one can imagine Bach improvising the music to begin with, then writing it down. And it presents us, for the first time in music history, I would guess, the idea of solitary music making, one person at the keyboard. But what's so interesting, I think, is that the music itself is still, in a sense, public. The public realm is recreated in that little room every time Bach played, because much of the material consisted of dances, which are, logically, a public thing. One can't have such a thing as a private dance, really. And the music itself embodies forms of dialogue, forms of question and answer, which imply a kind of virtual community, I think. And that sense of a virtual public realm within what becomes an increasingly a private experience is what helps to articulate classical music and keep it from becoming what I would call pathological, so that it makes possible the notion of a shared private experience, which otherwise seems paradoxical. You know, it is possible for several hundred people to sit in a concert hall and have a shared private experience of a Brahms symphony or a Haydn symphony because the musical material itself is shared. You know, it embodies itself forms of social being. I think what's happened now, don't ask me what I mean by now, I suppose, you know, since the Walkman, you know, to take that as a handy terminus, and you know, with all the technologies that have followed since, we've moved into a realm where I think many musical experiences now are not just private in their mode of delivery, let's say, you know, iPods and so forth, but they're more and more private in their material. To me, many forms of electronica music, for example, you know, the kind of music that's so eloquently reviewed in Wire magazine, which in ways I can never understand, seem to me to embody a form of consciousness that's entirely subjective and entirely private and no longer rooted in anything shared or communal. And I think when that happens, I think there's a danger that music could become, in a way, denuded. It would lose part of its very essence, which for me is to create a shared public realm, and become merely a kind of purveyor of a fantasy landscape. And I know it's very dangerous to try and deliver, you know, value judgments about different forms of music, but that seems to me, you know, a momentous severing of music from its past, as I say, that stretches back millennia. And it is, to me, a worrying one, something that we should be concerned about.
Thank you.
I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Let me just link that back to your opening thoughts, Marshall, in terms of what I've been saying about music being about, you know, classical music being about subjective states. Yeah. And it does have this funny thing about it. It seems to speak directly to one. It's almost as if, as it's played, it comes into existence just for me, and then goes away again at the moment it comes into existence. And so, you know, I wasn't the one who came up with this, it was Hegel, but, you know, he said that by having that ephemerality, it speaks to the lack of stability in our own subjectivity. Yeah. He called it, you know, rather beautifully, the art of the soul, or the ideal breath of the soul, because it corresponded to our subjectivity. And Ivan seems to be making that sort of argument as well, that it's sort of a bourgeois thing. It's quite limited. It comes into experience. The Purcell point makes me think of something I was listening to recently. It was actually the experience of the English Civil War and the Commonwealth period, which sort of smashed up the public performances. You know, theatres were closed down, churches were closed down, and music was forced into the private, domestic settings in a way. So just...
Well, it's interesting that about being forced back into the domestic or the private, and you've obviously made, both of us, we were both talking about the idea of privacy as a new phenomenon, you said, and obviously in many ways that's absolutely the case, you know. But in another sense, I think we've kind of forgotten something, which is that we are all listeners to music, and we have that privacy from the day we're born. I mean, I'm reminded of of Stockhausen's story. He was taken into an anechoic chamber where you supposedly can't hear anything at all. Everything was closed down, kind of perceptual information. And after a very small amount of time, he said to the engineer, "I can hear two sounds." And the guy said, "Yes, you can hear your own your blood circulation, and you can hear your own nervous system." And then they talked about the pitch and the rest of that. And Stockhausen says at that point, he said, "At that point, I ceased to worry about the future of music." And the point is, you know, as kids we have this. I can remember at the age of 3, or I think it was about 3, I used to close my eyes and look at the kind of pictures that would appear there, and I'm just being a viewer in a gallery. So actually, we all have that. That perceptual privacy is something we definitely have. I think in a way what you're getting at is that socially militated completely against the ability to do that. Sit down and listen to the Woods too much and you'll be dead. And obviously now we have that kind of thing. So I think privacy is an interesting thing because it's not something new for us. But I think what's happened to us is that we've come into a kind of Christmas land where we have this eternal gift, free gift apparently, of privacy compared with how things were. And I think the last half decade, last half century, has shown that we're not yet very skilled at dealing with that.
No, indeed. No, I think I think I think our bodily equipment, our somatic kind of basis, forces us really imperiously towards subjectivity all the time. We tend to lose ourselves in fantasies at the slightest, the smallest encouragement. We like, states of, enjoy states of drunken stupor or dreams or daydreams. It's so much nicer than reality, isn't it, to lose yourself in daydreams? And I suppose a lot of the function of social forms down the millennia has been to quite forcibly drag us out of that and say, no, you have to pay attention. You've got to be with your fellow man and woman. You can't lose yourself. You've got to take a role. And maybe music was part of that, bringing us back out of that slightly infantile subjectivity.
But Gabby, where do you stand on this way of looking at it from Marshall and Ivan? Because, as I say, they're sort of saying that in the shareability, there's private composition for private listening from the one to the one, but also to the many. There's a shareability that comes about through some bits of music, Bach in this example, being taken up into a tradition and stamped as good, and then they live after on and on through the repeatability that's in the score and the convention. Whereas you were coming at from the spontaneous composition that is. It has been recorded, but it won't be played again. And if it was, it wouldn't be the same.
No.
And you seem to have a different driver as well. That the tradition is something that needs to be demystified. So, just your thoughts on that.
I suppose improvisations are sort of a classic example of something that is very, very much in the moment. Which, of course, when you listen to a recording at home, especially recently. There would have been countless takes, overproduced, and you are hearing something which is there's nothing fresh at all about it. So I suppose actually a sort of an example of this was when I studied composition as well. But for me, it was the physical act of writing music. I never cared about whether I heard what I wrote at all. It was the process of it. And I suppose that's, sums things up.
But can I ask you a question about that, and then I'll go out to the audience on it? Is the performance that you just gave us with Pedro, how do I, and this is I hope not a silly question, how do I know if it was any good or not? Because it will never happen again, and I don't have the benefit of, apart from asking the audience to vote, I don't have a way of sharing judgments which build up over time that you get through repeated performance.
Well, I suppose that's the wonderful subjective thing about music, is that you can make that opinion for yourself. And it's fine. Wasn't there someone, was it, I think a playwright recently put outside the National Theatre or after a whole weekend festival, please, you're not meant to like everything. And it's perfectly possible to say, you know what, it's just not my thing. And as a performer, I would rather much more of an opinion. I like walkouts, actually. I did a piece of Lackerman Pression with a 5-troupe naked dance company, and we got booed every night. And I thought, well, actually, you know what, it's better than, oh, that was nice. I just find that reaction so middle of the ground. And I think, I'm not like I'm going out to provoke a strong reaction one way or the other, but I think just allowing an audience to make up their own mind, and these days sharing it publicly, that's a whole other debate. But I think that's an exciting time we're in.
Okay, so thoughts on that? What's the balance to be struck there between complete freedom to make up your own mind and sort of inability to make up your own mind without any rules, which I guess is one of the things that we're discussing.
A question to start with. I'm getting a little bit confused between, because there seems to be a bit of interchange between, on the one hand, private, and on the other hand, individual, and then on the other side of things, public and communal. Mm-hmm. And maybe to ask another question to kind of clarify that, why would me if I was the only person here listening to the piece of music just now, why would that necessarily be a private experience? Because surely there's something public in the creation of the music. There's an engagement with the world that, yes, it was through an individual's engagement with the world, but part of I'm a little confused, as you can see. But
Yeah, well, I was going to say that, in a sense, every listening experience is subjective in fields of art music, because the complexity of the material, whether we're talking about Bach or Lachenmann, is such that 120 people come out of an audience and hear a different thing, as you find very much as a composer when people kind of say what they thought, and or if two critics or performers go and hear a performance of a piece they both know, they could have been listening to something different. In a way, the miraculous power to kind of renew itself that we get in so many areas of the music you're talking about is that it plays not one concert to 120 people, but 120 different ones. And we don't go through, normally, but not, even if it's something like Barber's Adagio or something which has become sort of encoded with all kinds of overlaid stuff, perhaps unimagined by him, even there people receive different kind of resonances from it. And the music retains and slowly releases things, if it's any good, that mean we all hear a different concert. And that is an immense and fathomless resource that we must hold on to.
Well, I just would like to know your view on whether music can actually be both private and public at the same time, because I feel that everybody will have always their own view on the music that they hear, but also the people that make it also have their views. And when you listen to it, you're also having your private, but the person who made it is also there. So isn't it public as well, even if you're only two people there?
While I wouldn't at all disagree with anything that any of the panelists said about the power and strength of hearing music in a public place, in a live one-off performance, I would slightly defend the medium of recording. Now, when I think of when I first got to know music, so much of those experiences were through recordings, and it wasn't just about being able to reach out and listen to repertoire that didn't happen to be performed in my local concert hall. It was also about developing a fascination with and being profoundly moved by a particular interpretation that I could hear over and over again. And when I sit in a concert hall, I'm not sure I'm actually after anything very different to that. It might be that the performer would say that the experience of performing to an audience profoundly changes what they would do, but then conversely, someone in a studio might, over a series of sessions, a series of days, also be trying to create, not something definitive, because that's never possible, but a statement. So for me, listening privately at home through a stereo system can be a profoundly, and is a profoundly moving musical experience, just as much as being in a concert hall.
Just to quickly say something about that one, because it seems to me we almost want to take refuge in talking about the qualities and the advantages and disadvantages of various technologies, or not having the technologies. I mean, I agree with you. I've had huge gains through being able to listen to recorded music. But I come back to this other thing, which is it's not about the technology. It's about our listening and our way of reacting. And I think the questions that have come, the other questions are fascinating about the fact that in a public space, of course, there is private listening going on. That's exactly what it is. The big difference is that by being at the same event, we're able to calibrate. It's about communicating with each other. We all disagree about what goes on in those performances, but the fact is that it's only if you're in the same hall at the same time that you can then communicate with each other about what that listening experience at that moment was for you, and it's not a better or a worse.
And also, I think that, the musical material helps you to do that, because I think there's this time lag between new technological forms of delivery of music and the development of the music itself. I mean, I imagine you're referring to, on the whole, to music that's centuries old, created way before recording came along. And so it's, in a sense, it's not created for that medium. And maybe as time goes on, we're seeing new forms of music coming into being that are that are called into being by the new way of listening, in fact, that are purely private.
Yeah.
And just to go back to someone's point about improvised music, I wonder whether, even in that case, where you seem to have something entirely spontaneous created in front of you, which therefore deprives you of any kind of basis of judgment, apparently, to talk about it, what surprises me about free improv is how it's developed its own culture. And it's now its own tradition. So when you hear some, bright 25-year-old free improviser play, you can say, oh, well, yes, he or she's obviously learned from Evan Parker, or that reminds me of, some interesting, Japanese electronic artist that you saw at Cafe Otto the week before. So it becomes part of a discourse. Actually, it doesn't float in a vacuum. These things they become part of a conversation.
Yes, I mean, improv obviously has got its own sort of context now as well, and there's improv clubs sort of popping up, and you go and see someone who's sort of, there is some context about it. But I really agree with you about recorded music. I think maybe I looked like I was sort of sticking up for live performance over recorded music, and to be honest, I wouldn't be able to learn most of the repertoire I learn without recorded music these days because of lack of rehearsal times. I'm often sent albums or CDs to listen to in order to learn. And I maybe should bring up that point again, that isn't it interesting that the vinyl has never taken off so much as it has now. It's had a gap, of course, but, to sell it in Whole Foods is interesting. I think people are maybe returning to how it was 50 years ago, where you listened to, and obviously in pop music, the club scene has made it a popular thing again. But in classical music, for me, I can't think of anything more luxurious than listening to a Mahler symphony on a vinyl. That for me is just beats anything.
So my question's primarily directed at Professor Hewitt. We've heard quite a few people trying to define public and private. As a performer of improvised dance, I'm really interested in your differentiation between dance and music, and to say that there is no such thing as a private dance. What makes the differentiation between those art forms for you?
I suppose I was referring to, the way through much of its history, classical music has, embodied forms of social dance in its grammar, if you like. So much of the great tradition is in dance forms, I guess, and it's that gives this wonderful paradoxical quality to things like Bach's keyboard music, that they're both solitary. You can enjoy them in your room, and you can feel them under your fingers, and yet they create this sort of this virtual social event happening.
Yeah, there's sort of danceability built in, isn't there, through the melody?
I'd go further. I actually think it's the same thing, but you're talking about different modalities. I mean, I always remember learning how to play a minuet, working with dancers, and what the body does in those steps. So, I mean, I'm sure I was shouted down by some people, but to me, they're just different. They're just different ways of perceiving a kind of universalism of expression.
Right, before this all goes completely free improv, I'm going to try and take anybody else who wants to speak, and before we bring in people for closing comments.
Yeah, just another question about this kind of change that took place that you both said is around the time of the Walkman, but I think you don't really mean the Walkman, but something deeper than that. But Ivan in particular said that it wasn't just the mode of delivery, but the actual material that starts to change at that point as well. And I just wondered if you could say something a bit more about what you mean by that. And secondly, is that something that you think is as important or more important than this thing that Angus is talking about, which is much more about our inability to make common judgment that kind of starts to arise at that point as well?
Yeah, I have a question, because I think there's a difference between, having music in the background. I have music in the background all of the time because I like the noise. But I think there's a difference between that and being at a performance where you're actively listening. And I think in the blurb for this session, you talk about somebody had a suggestion that there were visuals going along at classical music concerts. So isn't part of that, if somebody's talking about having a visual that's different, that's more than just the people in the orchestra playing, what they're saying is there's no inherent value to the music that overrides everything else, because surely a great piece of classical music doesn't need anything else to support it. So I suppose my question is that, if people are suggesting that somehow when you go to a phenomenal classical performance, you need something else going on in the background, they're saying, number one, that the music itself is not inherently of value, but also maybe the public doesn't have the capacity to appreciate the inherent value of that music, which, I wouldn't agree with.
So I was going to say on something else, but just on that really briefly, but why shouldn't it have the visual? I mean, what art evolves and changes, and some people will perform it using authentic ancient instruments and say that's the only way to perform Bach, and some people will have nude people, maybe in front of or behind, I don't know. Anyway, so why shouldn't it? Art moves on. And I do wonder whether, Ivan says, things have changed with the Walkman, and it's certainly possible, but I do also wonder whether things have always changed. I mean, the first thing you could say is that there's just a general trajectory of human progress, and particularly with technology, where the act of performing something is kind of able to be time-shifted. The writing is the most obvious. Speech is separate from the recording of speech. That happens a very long time ago, and it just continues to happen. And so performance and the presentation of the music, and then the recording of it, either in sheet music, and then because obviously that's a transition, the ability to transcribe music. So all of these things just keeps happening, and you're probably right. The music has taken a kind of different form after the Walkman. But I feel like I'm often surprised. I don't know a lot about classical music, but I know what I like. No, forget that. Struck. But I'm struck when people lump it all together. I mean, to me, Beethoven. Let's march on. Hey, we come back. We won this time. That's very different to Bach. The experience you have, the much more abstract kind of thing. So I think even within it, performance changes. The actual thing that's being conveyed changes at different historical periods. So we can't kind of lump it all in on its how it's delivered, the fact that it's delivered in performance or with certain instruments. The thing that's being presented is changing. And I think one of the problems is that the word music is attached to so many different things. It's attached to performance, it's attached to composing and all this kind of stuff. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to try and experiment within that. I mean, free improv, I've only recently been introduced to it, and I think it's just fantastic to make you think about what it is to kind of interact with something, what it is to compose. I think if you're right that it has its own tradition, then it's time to move on, because it's all about playing around with the immediacy. Yeah.
It occurs to me that there's change and there's change. I mean, there wasn't Wagnerian opera before Wagnerian opera, so certainly that came into being and it was a change. But it wasn't a change that came into existence because it thought that it needed to compensate in some way or was embarrassed by traditional music. It didn't kind of say, as a lot of new audience development projects today do say.
Up, but I think that's a myth.
Hang on. I'm responding to your point, which you made eloquently and at length, and I just want to, have this idea out there as well, is that there are changes being made because people think some things have to be demystified, or they're too difficult for young people, and they're just not happy with the way they are, and that's not quite the same as making something new.
Yes, to address this point about change slightly differently, I think to assess musical developments, we have to engage with them beyond the individual, so beyond just listening ourselves. And that's where I see the retreat, really, is that we know what we like and we listen to it ourselves, but to go beyond that and to try and, commit to it or argue for it, I think that's something that people find quite difficult today. So when I ask people, my problem is that I don't know what to listen to. And so when I sort of search for guidance to sound like I'm sort of going to counselling, I get a kind of, well, what do you like as a response, rather than just a kind of, this is what you should listen to. I'm perfectly capable of trying and engaging with it and then turning it down. So I think what you really have is a privatisation of judgment over music. And that means if something, as far as I'm concerned, something new may come along, a musical tradition, potentially, and I wouldn't hear about it, I wouldn't know about it, and we wouldn't be able to recognise it, because we have to do that socially, we have to do that communally. So that would be my point about change. The only thing I would also throw in is that apart from the technological developments you've mentioned and the social cultural ones that people have picked upon in the audience, obviously there is something to be said for playing an instrument. And that is something that has also predicated prior to the technological changes. And I think there's something in terms of engaging with music and interpretation, being able to play it yourself, which is a private act, but then you can go and kind of experience it differentially in a music hall. There's something about attention really there, paying attention, whether it's listening or playing. And that's what I'd like.
Ivan?
I'd take the gentleman's point. It's very easy to privilege one's own era as being somehow, unique and special in its changes. And of course, there always has been change, profound ones even between Bach and Beethoven, as you mentioned. Tiffany has anticipated my final point, really, by mentioning playing, because to me, the history of classical music is like a long withdrawing roar, or whatever the phrase is, a decay, a long tail of fading, as it were, of social substance, as that was Adorno's phrase, in music. It's etiolated, it gets thinner and thinner, and it's preserved for a while through the 18th and 19th centuries in the act of playing, with people having piano music in their stools at home, and that's how they kept a sensuous contact with the grammar of the music, and that's why they didn't need the visual help that the other commentator mentioned that we should have nowadays. They didn't need it. They didn't need that stuff because they could feel the shape of it as they heard it under their fingers almost. But that's disappeared now, and my slight anxiety about the kind of vast hypermarket that music has become is precisely that it maroons people in a sea of infinite choice, where their sensuous communal contact with the forms of music has now entirely faded away, and so they're left with nothing but a kind of vague personal choice. Oh, I like that. I fancy that, and they grab it out of this whirl of this phantasmagoria of million kinds of music that's out there, and they probably won't stick with it for very long, because why should they? Because there'll be another flavour along any minute now, and so yes, indeed, I think we need more. We need to revive and nurture a felt engagement with music through doing it.
Gabby, your last thoughts?
Last thoughts, I suppose, which we haven't really discussed, but it's made me think a lot, especially what Tiffany said, is about, the education, how we're educating children to appreciate and listen to music, because it is something, as adults, we are asking for guidance. We're asking what to listen to and then how to listen to it. And I know, speaking as a mother, my daughter goes to colour strings, which is an education, a Kadai method of educating children with music, which is free in Scandinavian schools, and I have to pay a hefty amount. But within about 10 minutes of the class is basically 15 2.5-year-olds listening to a piece of classical music, and they all lie down on the floor, and it is quite an amazing thing to watch, because they really are quite quiet. And if they're not, that's fine too. But I think that is an important thing, is where it all starts from, that the children are given time, and part of the curriculum maybe even. And then, my other point would be, yes, it's not all doom and gloom. This idea of this death of the concert hall, I think we do underestimate the power of live music, and that people actually can really listen very well. In my experiences in America, where I didn't expect it at all. And I just feel as well, it's also okay not to enjoy going to concerts. I know a very prominent conductor who can't bear going to public concerts, and my father even said he's probably slept through some of the best concerts in the world. And I think there are these rules are there, and they should be broken.
Marshall.
The most powerful thing that hits me at the moment is, and it links in from what Ivan was saying about, we've got all this choice. It reminded me, it makes me think that we're in a kind of amazing, massive supermarket. And we can buy easily, but we can't give value easily. And the worst thing is that we've lost our own judgments, and everybody has that judgment. We've kind of lost our own judgment about what it is. So it reminds me that, we no longer live in the same way in shared traditions. I think Robbins Landon was the person who said that the 1790s in London was the last time there was a really strong shared tradition. And when Haydn came to London in 1791, a few miles away from here, everybody knew it was said, who he was, what he did, and could understand it in a shared way. And we've lost that. And instead, we have, I think, did you refer to a privatization of judgment? And that's exactly what's happened. We've let our society make up its mind for us. So you go to the supermarket of music and you decide how much you can afford and what you want to buy, and then you take that, and deep down you're not quite sure if it's what you want or how you should be listening to it. And that sense of fear is something I see a huge amount of the time.